welcome back to my channel, and today we're finishing Where is the Great Barrier Reef? So we're gonna go back to where we left off, which is somewhere. I think we can finish this. Let me just go back to where we were. So if I was correct, we left off at chapter 6. Right? Correct. Unknown Southland. So let's get into reading that. The unknown Southland, Terra Australis Incognita, existed in people's minds long before European explorers sailed the South Seas. In 350 BC, the Greek philosopher Aristotle described how the winds from the north, from the Arctic, brought snow and water to the European continent. He imagined there must be a southern continent where the winds blew from the south. This was long before anyone knew the continents of Australia or Antarctica existed. In the 15th century, a Roman mapmaker called this imaginary southern continent Australis. In Latin, that means south or southern. Some researchers believed that Portuguese sailors spotted the Australian coast from their ships in the early 1500s. But at the time, the rest of the part of the world had been claimed by Spain. The Portuguese kept the discovery as a secret. In 1606, a Dutch explorer named Willem Janszoon landed on the north coast of Australia. He was the first European to set foot on the continent. For the next 40 years, Dutch sailors explored the northern and western coast of the continent. They called it New Holland. As they explored, they drew maps of the areas. Some maps showed the coast connected to Papua New Guinea, but others did not. No one knew yet if Australia was an island. In the 1760s, an Englishman named Alexander Dalrymple found an old map from 1606. After studying it, Dalrymple believed that Terra Australis must be huge. He published his ideas, saying that the southern continent could be larger than Asia. Dalrymple's work caught on the attention of the British government in 1768. Oh, sorry, I just read that wrong. In 1768, Captain Cook was sent on his famous voyage. Cook was the first European to explore the east coast of Australia, which he named New South Wales. He sailed along the coast through the Great Barrier Reef. After exiting the reef, he was headed toward Torres Strait. Now he saw that Terra Australis was separate from Papua New Guinea. Still, no one knew that Australia was an island until 1803, when Englishman Matthew Flinders sailed all the way around it. Here is a picture of Matthew Flinders that sailed around Australia. Terra Australis, to be exact. In 1814, Flinders published a book about his journey. He called the southern continent Australia, saying that it was more agreeable to the ear than Terra Australis. Flinders also named the collection of reefs along Australia's east coast. He called them the Great Barrier Reefs. People from England began moving to Australia in 1788, not many years before Flinders' voyage. The first settlement was Sydney, about 800 miles south from the Great Barrier Reef. In the 1850s, gold was discovered. More people moved to the continent. As the years went on, people moved farther and farther north and closer to the reef. Australia's first European settlers. The first English settler in Australia did not come by choice. They were prisoners. 18th century England was changing fast. The population was growing, and people began moving from the country to cities in huge numbers. From the same country to the cities in huge numbers. Wait. I just said that. The people began moving from the country to cities in huge numbers. At the same time, machinery began to do the jobs people used to do. Many people lost work and became poor. Crimes like stealing rose quickly, and prisons became overcrowded. So the government began sending convicts overseas to work off their sentences. For a long time, England sent prisoners to America, but after the United States declared its independence in 1776, this had to stop. Australia was the natural next choice. So in 1787, a fleet of 11 ships sailed from England to Australia. The ships were carrying supplies, marine officers, and almost 800 convicts. The journey took 8 months. In January 1788, they settled in Port Jackson. The captain of the fleet called it the finest harbor in the world. He named their new settlement Sydney. By 1840, 150,000 convicts had been shipped to Australia, but now free men and women in England were choosing to make a new home on the distant continent. The last convict ship landed in Australia in 1868. By 2015, Australia was home to more than 23 million people. The Barrier Reef was rich in natural resources that could be shipped all around the world. By 1860, 3 major seaports were built along the reef's coastline. Islands in the lagoon became coconut plantations and limestone quarries. Trees were chopped down for firewood. Sea turtles, dugongs, and birds were hunted for food and for sport. Oyster beds disappeared. Reef fish and sea cucumbers were hauled out of the sea by the ton. On the mainland, forests were cleared to make way for farms and cattle ranches. Swamps were drained to plant sugarcane. Runoff and sediment poured into the lagoon. Harmful chemicals followed. Once the fertilizer became more widespread, once the use of fertilizers became more widespread, coral along the shoreline and seagrass meadows began to die out. The habitats of the Great Barrier Reef were suffering. Also suffering were the native peoples. The Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Island tribes of the reef had lived on this land for thousands of years. Now is being taken away from them. The Aborigines fought back for more than 100 years, but there was no match for the settlers' firepower. By the 1930s, perhaps more than 30,000 Aborigines and more than 2,000 white Australians had been killed. Sickness brought over from Europe killed even more Aborigines than the settlers' guns. By the time Australia became an independent country, as many as 9 out of every 10 native Australians had died from disease or violence. Even after the fighting ended, native Australians were treated as second-class citizens for many years. The Australian government took Aboriginal children away from their parents to train them as servants. Aborigines were made to assimilate or become more white Australians. They were removed from their homelands and sent to cities. Until the 1960s, Aborigines were segregated or separated from white Australians in places like movie theaters and hospitals. In some areas, they were not allowed to vote until 1962. From the 1960s until today, the Australian government has been gradually trying to fix the wrongs of the past. Since 1971, more than 30 Aborigines, many of them women, have been elected to Australia's state, territorial, and federal governments. Today, Aborigines, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but I'm pretty sure I am. Make up about 3% of the country's population, and they have many more rights than they once did. But they still face prejudice and racism. I'm just gonna check how many pages are left. Still quite a bit. During the 1800s, the early maps of the Great Barrier Reef were incomplete. Traveling through it was dangerous. Since coral grows taller every year, the safe pathways were always changing. Because of this, there were many shipwrecks. When some reef tribes first met shipwrecked Europeans, they thought the pale-faced sailors must be ghosts of dead relatives who had now come back on ghost ships. As for the Europeans, they told the tales about these reef natives. Some described them as cruel and murderous savages, but almost always the natives helped the castaways they met. This is the picture. Chapter 7, Save the Reef. 2 books published in 1893 and 1908 brought the natural wonders of the Great Barrier Reef to the world's attention. William Saville Kent studied the reef for 4 years. He discovered many species of fish and coral. He created detailed color sketches of as much as he could. He even photographed fish in a portable aquarium made out of giant clamshell. His book, The Great Barrier Reef of Australia, was published in 1893 became a total sensation. People around the world were now knew about the Great Barrier Reef. In 1896, Ted Banfield and his wife Bertha visited Dunk Island in the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon. They fell in love with the place. The very next year, with help from the local islanders, they built a cabin. The Banfields ended up staying for the years. The Confessions of the Beachcomber, Ted's 1908 book, was about their life on the island. Also became a worldwide bestseller. Suddenly, everyone wanted to see what the Great Barrier Reef was all about. In 1920, resorts began to pop up on the island on the lagoon. Visitors swam among the coral reefs. They went spearfishing. They watched turtles lay their eggs. Scientists traveled to the area too, hoping to learn more about the reef. In 1922, a group of the scientists warned that the resort was damaging the reef, but tourists continued to visit well into the 1960s. The reef began polluted with sewage and trash. Tourists snatched bits of coral and shells as souvenirs. Reefs were blown up, and the forests were cleared to make room for airstrips, marinas, and passageways for boats. Entire sections of the barrier reef began to die. Fishermen noticed that catches were smaller, and the water was getting cloudier. When the government began selling sections of the reef to oil companies, things had gone far enough. Now it was time for people to take action. So this video is getting pretty long, and I think we should end now. And I'll post a video really soon about me reading like the last 5 pages of it. I just don't have enough time right now. This is how much we have left. So we're on page 96. That's where we're leaving off. And I will see you guys again very soon with our next read aloud.